Hi, I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to Fiftyfaces TV. This is where we sit down with legendary figures in the investment landscape and speak with them about what's on their mind. We're delighted to be joined today by Ashby Monk, who's an executive and research director at Stanford. We wanted to ask him about his recent research work on the topic of organizational culture and identity, and how that informs how they approach investment, how they can become more efficient about investment, and how prospective funds can approach them with this identity in mind. Welcome, Ashby. Great to see you here.
Amazing. Thanks, Ethan. It's always daunting to be called legendary right out of the gate. Then you got to live up to it. But I'm excited to be here and chat with you about an area I love, which is investment decision making.
Well, let's launch straight in. And I want to ask you, what first interested you in studying organizational culture and identity relating to that?
Ultimately, my work at Stanford and outside of Stanford is on asset owner organizational design, which I acknowledge is a bit of a mouthful. But these are pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, endowments, and foundations. If you add them up and you sort of aggregate all the capital, you've got about $140 trillion. And that's really the base of capitalism today. And, you've seen banks being kind of regulated out of risk taking. And so the asset owner segment, often through managers, have stepped into the void. That's partly why you could see this private credit boom explode among asset owners. This is them moving into fulfilling the role of risk capital in the capitalist system. And so the notion of an investor identity is about unraveling how these investment organizations combine all of their various production inputs in order to actually achieve their goals. In order to do that, they have some sort of a risk budget, but they have the same 7 inputs, and that's what we refer to as the identity. They have their capital, which comes with encumbrances, time horizons, liquidity needs. They have their people. They can bring those people in-house. They can hire them through managers or consultants. They have process. You'd think of that as investment committee, delegation frameworks, things like that. And they have information, which maybe they get from setting up overseas offices, or they subscribe to Bloomberg or Atapar or any of these tech platforms. And then the final 3 are the enablers that allow you to improve those production inputs, and that's governance, culture, and technology. And we wrote this up into a framework called the investor identity because we want to provide that $140 trillion worth of capital with kind of a guide book on how you can improve your organization so that you can improve your asset allocation, you can improve your implementation, and you can drive higher returns for the benefit of your stakeholders and, fingers crossed, the benefit of the world.
That's fascinating. And it reminds me of some work that's been done on countries and how they respond to challenges, which can actually relate directly to their resources and constraints, as well as natural resources that they may have, which may offer benefits. So it seems like this discussion around identity is really informed by the natural advantages, but equally constraints or cost restrictions that an entity might have. Can you take us through some of the different kinds of identities that an organization might have?
Yeah, of course. So we when the identity comes together into a coherent organizational strategy, which combines into an effective asset allocation implementation, you get what we in the industry call a model. You've heard of the Yale model, I assume. This was a university endowment in Connecticut, Yale University. David Swenson looked at his capital, his governance, his culture, his technology, his people, process, and information, and made the bet that through intelligent liquidity models, through tapping the Yale University alumni network, through quite literally using the golf course at Yale to build relationships with his asset managers, he could build a unique portfolio that was highly tilted towards alternatives and back those managers in ways that other investors couldn't. That's the Yale model. And because it performed so well, it became a role model. And ultimately, in our industry, We don't have schools of investment, which I'm trying to change. I'd love to build the first school of investment. We have role models where you see a pension fund or an endowment start generating high performance, and quite literally, you try to copy it. That's what we've seen with the Canadian model being copied in, Netherlands, Australia. That's going on around the world where these best practices are in effect lifted from successful funds and applied internally. So in terms of the existing models, you have Yale, I've already described that. The Canadian model is really an internal model where, thanks to their governance, they have a crown corporation model, which means they can pay salaries out of their asset base. They can hire amazing people because they can pay high compensation. So their people are quite competent at doing direct transactions. And so they go direct. So that's the Canadian model. The Norway model is associated with sustainability, scale. They divest from companies that are bad actors. They name and shame them. They have an incredibly effective passive portfolio with a mix of active managers. And so that kind of ethical, passive, global portfolio, largely public markets, has come to be thought of as the Norway model. It's also a governance model for other sovereign funds around the world. You'll often hear governments say, oh, we're going to copy Norway when we launch this new sovereign wealth fund. So those are some of the existing ones, and then ones that I've worked on, because you can build new models. We've got 7 levers to pull: governance, culture, tech, people, process, et cetera. We can build new models. And through that, we can drive higher performance and change the capital flows in our capitalist system. So we worked with CalSTRS on the collaborative model, which is really about using your peers to fill in the resourcing you might not have available to you from your governance structure. The collaborative model is about an innovation model. There's a new technologized model. You look around, you've seen Gen AI taking over. How are investors using it? Can they use that technology to drive long run performance? And then the last one that I'm working on right now is the resilience model, which is a kind of a tilt towards understanding how you build more resilient portfolios, not sustainability, but resilience, bouncing back from crises and growing and learning. So those are some examples. I don't want to take you too far down into each of them because each of them have their nuances. But yeah, this is the world of models and role models.
So that's interesting. So it's quite clear that these are not static models. So it might therefore, in theory, be possible for a model to morph from one into another. Is that something you've seen?
Totally. In fact, when we wrote the paper, there was a whole section on how should we think about innovation in the context of these models. I mean, if you look at the inputs I've just described, one of them is technology. That's changing very quickly. One of them is information, again, changing how we get it, how it drives our decision making. And people, again, people are being educated in new ways, getting new experiences. So as investment organizations, we need to take stock of our changing inputs, how they're combined, and constantly evaluate how are we accessing the universe of investable opportunities. And so ultimately, we do bring innovation into these organizations. Oftentimes, I'll tell you it's a crisis that drives the innovation. So a financial crisis, we've got the COVID crisis. But the purpose of the identity framework is to think of a constructive case for change rather than responding to a crisis. And the constructive case for change is this. Once you understand your identity, in theory, you can start to unravel your comparative advantages and your comparative weaknesses. And you can build on those advantages and ideally, hide or minimize the effect of your weaknesses. Every investment organization I've ever worked with, been around the world, I've done 1,000 meetings with organizations. They're all different. Their capital's different. Their stakeholders are different. Their people are different. They're in different locations. So the comparative advantages will be different. With that identity, you can then think, hey, what is the perfect allocation for us? How should we be allocating our assets? And then you can move into, now that we've defined an asset allocation, how should we implement it? And after you've got your organization, your asset allocation, and your implementation, all you kind of need to do at that point is sit back and see, how does it perform? And if it performs great, you learn something and people copy you. If it performs poorly, then you go back and you say, maybe I misunderstood my identity. Maybe I need to go back and revisit what I thought were my advantages, what I thought were my weaknesses, and assess whether or not I can do things differently.
So I can see it's very much an iterative process that involves self-reflection and then further iteration. Just bringing this all together then, how do you think that asset managers can bear identity in mind when they work with prospective investors in order to ensure the most effective and efficient dialogue between them?
I am inundated with friendly emails from well-meaning managers that are really just trying to understand who they should be talking to. Like I said, there's no university of investment. There's no school of investment at Stanford or Princeton or Oxford or any of the places I studied. And so you're sort of left to figure it out. And if we did have a school of investing at Stanford, a big part of it would be understanding the identity of investors so that you can sell them appropriate products. You can understand things that are going to help them or annoy them. So if you're, talking to a Canadian pension plan, you're probably not going to try to sell them a fund of funds product because they're an internalized program. If you're talking to an endowment, you're probably not going to sell them on a direct transaction. And then there's everything that's even more nuanced, whether it's a tech provision or a service around legal services, really unraveling who you're talking to is important. I can remember one Canadian pension plan talking about the process input, setting a delegation framework for their private equity team where the head of private equity could do a direct $500 million deal with the sign-off of only the CIO. Didn't have to go to the board or investment committee. Now, if you're an investment banker or you're a private equity fund, you should know that if you have a fast-moving big transaction, the first phone call that you're making. Those are the type of insights that I think really could benefit managers as they think about who they want to partner with. And by the way, these asset owners want to be your partner, not limited partner. I mean, they'll be your limited partner, but they want to be your actual partner. They want to help you drive performance because that goes back to their identity. If they can help you drive your performance, then that performance won't so quickly erode by the broader market. It's a more sustainable and resilient performance if the asset owner themselves can help contribute to it.
Fantastic. And I love that we've ended on this point of efficiency, because clearly the more efficiency we have in a process, the more that drives the net of fee return, which of course bolsters outcomes. Thank you so much, Ashby, for coming here for this absolutely fascinating discussion.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to 50 Faces TV.